And there's the beep. So yeah, let's look a little bit at tides. Ultimate cause of the tides is the moon's gravitational pull. There's a diagram of the Earth. There's the moon. Notice that they are both round. The flat earthers are just being silly. When you're on the side of the Earth that is facing the moon, the water gets pulled towards the moon, more so than the land is, being that the land is solid. The land actually does flex just a little bit towards the moon, but this is normally not easily noticed. This is not the kind of thing you can observe just by sitting there. Whereas you can observe that if you're on a beach or any coastline, the water level gets higher. And beg pardon, I've got somebody to let in, I think. So the water level will rise and rise and eventually reach a high point. And then it will go down, go down, go down, and eventually reach a low point. And typically the cycle will repeat itself. On the side of the Earth that's facing the moon, the water's pulled towards the moon, and that gives you this bulge of water. It's not nearly that tall, by the way. It may, well, how tall it is depends on where you are. It may just be a few feet. On the opposite side, there's a bulge away from the moon because the moon's gravitational pull is weakest, because gravity gets weaker the farther away you go from something. So because water is pulled less towards the moon, it forms a bulge on the opposite side. So as the Earth turns, those bulges get dragged around. If you could have an Earth that was perfectly smooth and didn't have any land, like it was completely covered with water and the bottom was completely flat and uniform and smooth and 10,000 feet down, then every point on the Earth would experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day, because as the planet turned, those bulges of water would get dragged around as the planet turned and the moon orbited. It's not nearly that simple, though, because the pattern is always being modified by the shapes of the coastlines. It can be modified by the shape of the bottom of the ocean. It can be modified by peninsulas or islands that bulge has to go around. It can be, in some places, it can be modified because you can have situations where a tide going out interferes with a tide coming in. In many places, the tide can actually lag behind the position of the moon. There's not that many spots where you notice the water starting to rise as soon as the moon rises, and it's at its highest when the moon is right overhead. It's often a lot more complicated a pattern than that. Predicting the tides has to be done for each individual location on Earth. And it's important because ships, of course, use tidal information. High tides are, good places to come into port, things like that. And so the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, handles tidal predictions and calculations for points all over the coast of the United States. And this is actually one that I downloaded just a few minutes ago. These are the tides for starting at midnight early this morning, going on until midnight 2 days from now. At one of the mouths of the Mississippi River, North Pass, otherwise known as Pas à l'Outre, Pass of the Otter. And you can see it's not a nice, simple sine wave. We're coming off a pretty high tide and heading down towards a very low tide. That green line is where is the time when I took this picture. And we're after that, there'll be a much smaller high and low, and then another high, but not as high, and so on. You can see it's not, a nice, simple oscillation all of the times. You can have pretty complicated patterns getting set up, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. And the range of tides between high and low can be anything from undetectable to many feet. The highest tides in the world are those in the Bay of Fundy in Canada, in the province of Nova Scotia. And that's because that bulge of water gets funneled into a narrow bay where the bottom slopes rather steeply. So when a bulge of water goes into that bay, the walls of the bay, the sides of the bay, get narrower and narrower. They get closer together. The bay gets more and more narrow. The slope rises very quickly, and there's no place for the water to go but up. So the tidal range like there, I want to say it's about 30 feet at its highest, at its greatest anyway. Those two pictures were both taken in 1972, and they were taken just a few hours apart. And you can see the difference between high and low tide in the Bay of Fundy. The greatest tidal range on Earth, I might add. Okay. Incidentally, tides may be the range of tides, the distance between a high tide and a low tide sea level may be exceptionally pronounced at times when the moon and sun happen to be lined up, meaning when the moon is new, i.e. you can't see it, or when the moon is full. When the moon is new and when the moon is full, then the centers of the Earth, moon, and the sun are nearly perfectly in line, and that tidal bulge is stronger than it usually is, and we call those spring tides. Not spring in the sense of the season, but spring in the sense of something springing forth. Your high tides will be unusually high, and your low tides will be unusually low. When the moon and the sun are at 90 degrees, they're not pulling along the same axis. They're pulling at right angles to each other. And that means that the lows are not nearly as low and the highs are not as high. And we call those neap tides. Neap is an old English word for to fade, to diminish. So typically twice a month you'll have unusually high highs and unusually low lows at the spring tides, and twice a month you'll have unusually low highs and unusually high lows at the neap tides. And this is correlated with phases of the moon. So tidal habitats or tidelands are zones that are subjected to tidal activity. They may be above water for part of each day. At its extreme, there are parts of the intertidal zone that may only get splashed with seawater maybe a few minutes a day, maybe not even that much sometimes. On the other hand, there are areas that might always be underwater except at the very low tides of a spring tide season. And the zone between the two is called the intertidal zone. Anything living in the intertidal zone has to deal with the fact that its home is going to be out of the water for at least part of the time. This could be anywhere from only a few minutes every month to virtually all the time. But that zone is called the intertidal zone. There are rocky coastlines are in the intertidal zone. If you've ever seen the ocean breaking on rocks in places like much of the coast of California or Oregon is very rocky. Soft substrate shores include sandy beaches, but also mudflats, probably everyone's favorite tidal zone. Down in South Louisiana, where I'm from, there's not a great deal of beach, and there sure as heck isn't any rock. What you get is tidal salt marsh, lots of seagrass and other adapted plants in a marshy habitat that just gets wetter and wetter until you finally reach the open sea. We've talked about mangroves a bit. Estuaries are the zones where rivers reach the sea, and those are strongly affected by tides. And then, of course, reefs are tidal. Well, they can extend down to the subtidal zone. They often do, in fact, but certainly the crests of reefs are very much in the intertidal zone. Many reefs actually are exposed at low tide. When I went to Hawaii with my family when I was in 6th grade, we got to walk around on some reefs. So again, tidal rise and fall means that your habitat is out of the water for part of the time. Some living things can move with it. Others can't. Living things that are stuck to rocks, for example, may simply be high and dry for a part of each day. That imposes heat stress on them, and it imposes desiccation stress, the stress caused by drying out. This means that there's selection on body size and shape. A large organism will retain its water for longer, but it also retains heat longer. So if you're on a tropical rocky coastline, being large means you can retain more water and you won't dry out as fast, but you'll also retain heat longer, which means you might cook. So exactly what the optimum is depends on what area you are. And we talk here about something called the surface to volume ratio. You may have been exposed to this before, and it is exactly what it sounds like. You measure the surface area of an organism or an organ or structure and divide it by the total volume. And what you'll find is that the surface area of something is a function of the square of its length. The volume is a function of the cube of its length, which means that if you have a small organism and a large organism, the large organism will have less units of surface area for every unit of volume that it's got. That means that a large organism won't be able to radiate heat as rapidly, and it also won't heat up as rapidly because heat transfer from that organism to the outside or from the outside to in the organism is a function of surface area. And the more volume it has per unit of surface area, the longer it will take to heat up and cool down. The same thing applies for gas transfer. If you have organisms that are absorbing oxygen or something else through their outsides, the larger they are, the more volume that they have per unit surface area, and the amount of oxygen they can take in is limited by the surface area. So the less oxygen per unit of living tissue they'll tend to have. Obviously, you can mess with this by changing shape. Large organisms often tend to have a lot more surface area because they'll have folds or wrinkles, something like that, like fish gills, for example. But that's something that comes into play when you're looking at organisms on rocky shores. And there may be only a few species that can survive in some of these tidal zones. And what you see as you explore a rocky coastline is what we call vertical zonation, which means that species tend to dominate particular bands, particular zones as you go from the high intertidal towards the low intertidal. That said, species that can move will migrate up and down with the tides. And if you're on a rocky shore, you're not only subject to being out of the water for part of the time, you're also often getting hit by waves. How much depends on where you are, but there are some rocky coastlines where the waves just absolutely pound you on a regular basis. You can be subject to abrasion because waves can pick up sand and throw it at you. And so organisms on rocky coastlines are often subject to getting worn away. Pressure drag is, water is flowing past you very rapidly and you're getting pulled with it. If you imagine a wave hitting a coastline and then the water rushes back out, it's moving rapidly. It wants to carry you along with it. But if you've got a high drag shape, it can't. And so that subjects you to force. And acceleration is, of course, you're just sitting there minding your own business, and all of a sudden you get hit with water moving very rapidly. You're accelerated a great deal. And that can tear you off your rocky coast and send you off to parts unknown. So living on a rocky shore is not easy. You have to deal with the forces of waves hitting you, and you have to deal with being out of the water. So on the coast of Maine, for example, the very highest intertidal zones might only get splashed with seawater now and again, maybe not even once every day. And they're dominated by blue-green bacteria and lichens. I'm assuming you remember that lichen is a symbiosis between fungus and algae. And they may be the only things that can live that exposed, in a zone that's hit by seawater, but is also left dry for possibly days on end. They may be the only thing that can survive. So you can see that lichen zone that's kind of blackish. Below it, you may be dominated by blue-green bacteria. That's where you'll slip and fall if you're not careful. And then below that, you can see a zone of brown algae. I don't know if you can read the writing. It says fucus and Ascophyllum nodosum. That's just two different species of brown algae. And you can see they make parallel bands. And you can see them again here. You can see the blue-green zone. The barnacle zone below it is dominated by barnacles. And then below that, you can see brown algae and red algae all the way at the bottom. And there's lots of variations depending on where you are in the world. There will be different species. The banding may vary depending on how steep the rocky coastline is. It might look very different on a vertical cliff as opposed to a more gentle slope. It will vary depending on just how heavy the local wave action is. But the basic idea applies that you have these horizontal stripes on a rocky coastline with different species adapted to living in one or another of those stripes, of those zones. We talked a little bit about why you get zones. Partly that's because of competition. You might remember we looked at that study of barnacles, where you have two species, one of which outcompetes the other. Balanus outcompetes Cathamalus, but Cathamalus can survive higher up in the intertidal than Balanus. So that's where we talked about fundamental niches versus realized niches. So that competition is partly what sets up that zonation. And it's also caused because different species differ in their levels of ability to resist heat stress. So something like a sea slug or a starfish or a sea anemone can't be out of the water for very long. So you're going to find those in the low intertidal or the low tide zone. They just would not survive higher up. On the other hand, things like limpets can live much higher because they can seal themselves up and keep from drying out. And of course, some rocky coast species migrate a lot. This is a crab that's native to the Pacific coast of mostly Mexico, South America, and the Galapagos Islands. This is the Sally Lightfoot. Strongly recommended reading is a book by John Steinbeck called The Log from the Sea of Cortez. He was a great novelist. You might have read Cannery Row or Of Mice and Men, but he was also good friends with a marine biologist named Ed Ricketts in the town of Monterey, California. And he and Ed and some of the local fishermen chartered a boat and sailed down to the Gulf of California, between the Mexican mainland and Baja California, and explored it and collected and wrote. Steinbeck in particular wrote not just about the science, but about his philosophical musings as well. And it's really an awesome book, especially if you've been there. And he writes about trying to capture Sally Lightfoot crabs, and it turns out to basically be impossible because they can climb what look like vertical walls much faster than a human can navigate them. And he writes some rather funny observations on trying to capture Sally Lightfoots. They're very good at migrating to stay in their preferred zone. They just, go out when the tide goes out and come up when the tide comes in. Other living things will tend to hang out in refuges. That's a tide pool at Santa Cruz, California. I used to see, when I was in grad school, I used to see environments like this all the time when I could get out to the ocean. The green things that you're looking at are giant Pacific sea anemones, Anthopleura anthogrammatica. Some of them, the ones over at the lower right, you can see have the tentacles out. The others have the tentacles retracted, probably because they're out of the water. Crawling around among them, those orange kind of spider-webbed looking things are Pacific sea stars, Pisaster ocratius. And these can stay in or very close to a tide pool until the tides come back in and the water level rises and they're joined again to the greater ocean. So tide pools are often refuges for intertidal life. And then animals that are exposed directly to pounding waves may minimize their pressure drag. Remember, pressure drag is caused by current hitting something. So if you're living on a rock and a wave hits you, that's the force that tends to push you off the rock. And you can minimize pressure drag with a nice low streamlined profile shape like these Pacific Coast limpets, Ladia digitata. All right, when I went down to Baja California, it was usually to help a friend of mine who was going down there to collect limpets for his doctoral dissertation. And he and some friends of his and we'd all go down, and I would just hang out and help, and they would go off and collect limpets and scuba dive and take drugs, and they would have a great time, and I would too. We talked a while back about ecological succession, and I think I mentioned that it doesn't have to, ecological succession does not always happen in a predictable way every time. Remember, in succession, you first would have pioneer species coming in. They would be replaced by others, and eventually you would reach a stable state called the climax community. But sometimes you can have alternate stable states. This was some work done on the Pacific coast of the Northwest US. What you're looking at is a bed of clams that cement themselves to rock by means of some very strong threads that they secrete. This is the California sea mussel, Mytilus californianus. edible as far as I know. I actually had a friend in grad school who used to camp out on the ocean and eat whatever he could find in tide pools. Quite a lot of it is apparently quite delicious. Cooking's not even necessary. Anyway, this is a dominant species in the middle intertidal, and it's preyed on by snails. There are snails that can actually drill holes in a shell and stick their little proboscis in and eat the critter out inside his own shell. If you destroy a small patch of mussels, which you could do experimentally, but also sometimes happens naturally, if a rock gets overturned or something, the bare rock gets colonized by a brown alga called Postelsia, the so-called sea palm. Very nice holdfast and stipe and blades visible right there. And then the mussels return over the course of a few years. So that's the course of ecological succession. Postelsia first, and then it slowly gets replaced by mussels. But if a winter storm wipes out a large patch of mussels, migration can't fill in the patch because it's too slow. Mytilus californianus can't move in to fill that patch up fast enough. What happens is that a different species invades the bare patch. It's called Mytilus trossulus, and here it is. And predatory snails can't crawl across bare rock, or at least they won't. They don't want to. So if some larvae of Mytilus trossulus settle in that bare patch and become adults, Trossulus can take over very quickly because the predators can't reach it. So you can have two different ways that ecological succession plays out depending on how large the region is that you're talking about. So that's what we call alternative stable states. So that's life on a rocky coast. Now let's see what happens when life's a beach. That was a joke. I'm imagining you laughing uproariously. The water in between sand grains is called pore waters. As we mentioned, there's a whole set of organisms that live only in the pore waters in between sand grains. They're called meiofauna. But pore waters also protect animals that burrow from drying out. If you're on a beach and you don't want to dry out, the thing to do is dig. And that will protect you from drying out or from temperature stress. And just like an apartment building has several levels, burrowing in a beach has several tiers. Some species may burrow just below the surface. Others might go quite a bit deeper down. Deposit feeders may compete with each other for food. Remember, deposit feeders are the ones that eat, either swallow sand or pick up food particles from the sand or mud. Suspension feeders may have to compete for space. The food supply is constantly being renewed whenever the ocean comes in, but there may be much less space. Deposit feeders don't compete for space so much because they can get out of each other's way, but food may be the limiting resource there if you're a deposit feeder. And just like plants do, animals living in soft substrates may engage in chemical warfare. A number of intertidal organisms produce compounds that contain the chemical element bromine. Bromine comes from the Greek word for bad smell. Bromine containing aromatic compounds are toxic, and they also smell really bad. You don't usually smell a lot of this at your typical Florida beach, but a type of unselective deposit feeders known as acorn worms tend to secrete lots of bromine containing aromatic compounds, and they stink. The problem is that when waves are breaking on a beach, they're constantly stirring up the sand. organisms have to either burrow out of the range of the waves or they have to get used to being frequently reburied. When I was a kid, we used to vacation every summer in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, which basically looks like this, except the sand is whiter. And it's a lovely place if you want to sit out in the sun and listen to the waves breaking and read a deliciously trashy novel and drink a lot of cold beer and play volleyball or whatever it is that you guys like to do on a beach. It's not that great for a young marine biologist in the making because there's not many living things on a beautiful, pure, pristine beach like this, because in its own way, it's not a very easy habitat to make a go of. Because the sand being constantly stirred up, you've got to adapt to that either by burrowing out of the way or getting used to being dug up and reburying yourself. There is life there, of course. This is my brother-in-law. Actually, that's a crab, but it's my brother-in-law that's holding him. That's a ghost crab, and you saw one of these on Monday. This is a ghost crab in genus Accipidae. They avoid wave action because they live high up on the beach, where the sand is not stirred up by the waves, but still moist. And they'll burrow pretty deeply into that moist sand, even if the outside is very warm and dry. Burrowing deep enough will get you into contact with moist sand that stays cool. So they'll stay there and then come out after dark to feed and also to breed. They will actually come down to the tide line to lay their eggs. And they go through a stage where they live in the water before they mature and come out on land to do their burrowing. So that's one way of avoiding wave action, is live so high up the beach that the waves don't reach you, but close enough to the water that the sand is moist and cool. Another critter we used to see in Florida is mole crabs, and these stay right where the waves are breaking. When a wave hits, water is forced among those sand grains, and the sand is temporarily very goopy. If you've ever played at a beach where the waves are coming in, you're probably familiar with this feeling, where the sand is very runny and you can run it between your fingers. And then as the water drains out of it, it starts getting firmer and packing up. Mole crabs are adapted to live in that fluidized zone, and they'll move up the beach and down the beach to stay in that fluidized zone. They're very, very quick to burrow in fluidized sand. So there's you a mole crab. There's a couple of coquina clams, and I showed you these earlier as an example of a selective deposit feeder, because when they're buried, they can stick out two little tubes called siphons and use those. One of them is almost like a little vacuum cleaner. That siphon, it can swivel around and pick food particles up off the surface of the sand. And they'll burrow in sand, but periodically they'll deliberately jump out and ride the waves. Well, they don't ride on top like a surfer, but breaking waves will pick them up and carry them, a little bit landwards when the tide's coming in, or seawards when the tide goes out. So they stay in the zone where the waves are breaking every few seconds. That keeps them in that swash zone. And I remember this at Fort Walton Beach, California. A wave would break, and you could see as the wave was going back out that it had uncovered some of these coquina clams, and they would probably burrow right back down. And then the next wave would come and uncover them again. So because they can rebury themselves very quickly, they can stay in that swash zone and ride the waves towards the land or away from the land as needed. If you have waves that aren't breaking so strongly, you may have gentler currents, and that usually means you get finer sand. The rule of thumb is the faster a current is flowing, the heavier are the particles that it can carry away. So on coastlines where you have waves breaking a lot with force, you tend to have coarse sand or possibly pebbles, just because everything smaller than a particular size tends to get carried away by the waves and the currents. So where waves are breaking hard, they carry away all of the fine stuff, and you end up with coarse sand and pebbles. Where waves aren't breaking so hard and currents are gentler, you tend to get finer sand or mud, and the gentle currents will create mounds of sediment, and they'll also create these ripple marks, these parallel ridges that you can see on the sediment surface. And you may have deposit feeders that will be concentrated in the troughs of those ripple marks because that's where dead organic stuff tends to collect. By the way, if you want to see some awesome ripple marks around here, get on Hogan Road and drive to US 64. Right, if you know where Hogan Road is, it's I guess the westernmost major road in this town. And, you go up Prince Street and then you turn and you go past the new post office and past some chain restaurants and past those ginormous apartment complexes. And then you go through a road cut that's been blasted through Cadron Ridge. And there's lots of rock visible on both sides. And if you can find a spot where you can see the surfaces of the rock, you'll see beautiful ripple marks. The best ones, for my money, are right in the driveway. Yeah, there's a gated driveway right as you get into Crowley's Ridge. It's not marked, but it's the driveway for the local emergency 911 response center. And right in the wall of that driveway, there's some gorgeous ripple marks. Because this particular part of Arkansas was a shallow beach with relatively gentle currents approximately 300 million years ago next Thursday. So you can see these in sedimentary rocks as well as seeing them in modern beaches. They just get sculpted by currents that are flowing in a particular direction at a low enough speed not to completely churn the sediment up. These things spontaneously form. Incidentally, they form perpendicular to the current direction. So they're forming, from this point of view, it looks like they're running from lower left to upper right. That's perpendicular to the direction that the current is actually coming in. Okay, there are clams that can burrow very shallowly, coquinas being an example, but there's also clams on a beach like this that will burrow much more deeply, and species can be specialized to burrow to different depths. There are some that might sit practically on the surface, like scallops. Coquinas would burrow very much more shallowly. But others, like a group of bivalves called the lucinids, K down there, the lower center is a lucinid bivalve, and those guys have very long siphons, those tubes that they use. So they'll take in water through one and expel it through another, and because of those long siphons, they can stay buried very, very deeply. They may never normally get out on the surface at all. The same for L. L is a large clam with two siphons that are fused together into a giant tube. That's called a geoduck clam. They are commercially dug up on the Pacific coast. In some cultures, they're considered a delicacy, and that's L at the lower center. They happen to be the mascot of Evergreen State College in the state of Washington. So yes, there are mascots that are weirder than the University of Arkansas Monticello boll weevils. There is the Evergreen State College gooey ducks, noted for their long, weird, slightly intimidating looking siphons. Anyway, you can see how different clams are specialized to different burrowing depths. Seasonal influx of predators can affect the benthos. These are migratory birds related to sandpipers called sanderlings. They may migrate from the Arctic to temperate locales each year. And when a migrating herd of sanderlings is in town, the intertidal benthos is going to get pretty severely eaten. They'll feed on clams. I forget if it's the sanderling, but there are migratory birds that feed pretty intensively on the eggs of horseshoe crabs. So a population may get significantly reduced every year by a seasonal influx of migratory predators. And I've got a little bit more, but I'm actually going to go ahead and stop there. And what I have, we will save for another day. So I will go ahead and pause, waiting for the screen to come up. And there we are. And I will stop recording.